Chapter 4. 20s Kicks. The picture of the doctor was fuzzy and distant. It was decaying as it replayed for the 100th time. It shimmered across a fiber screen, suspended in darkness. Fetid gases drifted across the picture, and rasping breath could be heard. The gasping increased, until a hiss burst from the silence.
Time, Lord. Not possible.
A second rasping voice countered.
They have not interfered for centuries. No.
A third voice agreed with the first.
He smells like a Time Lord. Nerve fibers have been stabilized,
the first voice hissed.
I wish the fourth of us were here. The knowledge in that area is more specialized. However, I have sound.
Let me through, the doctor said, advancing on the screen yet again. I am the doctor.
Doctor,
hissed the second voice.
He is the doctor.
A low hiss of surprise and fear echoed round the chamber. Finally, the third voice spoke.
A worthy adversary. He must be dealt with.
Bernice Summerfield wiped the sweat from her brow with a cloth. It was warm underground, the chemical lamps generating heat as well as light. She told the crew to knock off about an hour ago. They were sagging on their feet, and, besides, she could think better when she was alone. The official survey of heaven had somewhat speculatively labeled the arch as the Temple of the Sun, hypothesizing that the silver construction was aligned with the rising of heaven's sun on the solstices. Well, computer simulations had shown that to be rubbish. Typical of old archaeologists to call anything they couldn't understand a church. Benny was dusting around the outlines of the door now, feeling guilty for not having been there when the thing had been found in the earthen wall, 3 days before the money ran out. She already had a pass on a Draconian freighter heading out across their empire. She'd look around a bit in Draconian's space, see what they had on the fringes, maybe excavate something, maybe see if he'd come out that way. But she was damned if she wasn't going to open this door first. Fine brush, she muttered, reaching down into the kit bag she'd placed on the floor. Fine brush, a voice replied, handing her the tool. Bernice turned around slowly. Standing behind her, peering intensely at the carvings around the door, was a strange little man in a paisley scarf. Who are you? Said Benny, amused by the childlike look of concentration on the stranger's face. He seemed to snap out of his trance, and flashed her a lovely grin, doffing his hat and offering his hand. I'm the doctor, he said. I'm the professor. Benny shook his hand firmly. And I'm very busy, so yes, so am I. Paragosto stick? The doctor began to search through his pockets until he found what he was looking for. A thin silver probe with a tiny sphere on top. Now, we need a small object. Bernice looked around the chamber. It was as if suddenly she was in the wrong movie. Excuse me, but is this important? I've got a door to open. Doors. Tricky. Ah! The doctor produced a small cube from his pocket, and Bernice was suddenly very interested. The thing was almost invisible, like a ghost cube, or... No, it was solid as steel. Or maybe it was shining brightly. I see. Benny leaned on the wall and nodded. All right, this is a dream, isn't it? She pinched herself. Come on, I haven't got all night. Wake up, Benny, time to work. No time for dreams, the doctor smiled secretly. You're awake. This is a tesseract, the shadow of a four-dimensional hypercube. It can do all sorts of things, and I prepared it for a special task. But it can also be used to prove that what goes up... He threw the cube into the air, and his hands flashed over the sphere on the Paragosto stick in a complex pattern. The cube vanished. Benny blinked. The doctor relaxed, and tapped his chin with the stick. It's a game played between Time Lords, maneuvering an object across the dimensions. The loser is the one who lets it drop back into normal space. The Prydonians play it with spheres of pure platinum. I preferred rotten fruit. As we used to say, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. Benny paused, raising a finger. Oh, wait, tesseracts, Paragosto thingies, Time Lords. Do you know a young woman called Ace? Yes, the doctor said darkly. I travel with her. Through time and space, in a police box that's bigger on the inside than the outside. Any more questions? Benny reflected for a moment, then decided. What's the best Isley Brothers song? This Old Heart of Mine. Benny nodded solemnly. Correct. Surprising question, grinned the doctor. Well, Surprise is my middle name. Bernice Surprise Summerfield. My poor mum wanted to hammer that point home, I think. Now listen, I'm stacking up all these fascinating conversations to have later, but I really do need to open this door. What's the time? The relative measurement of the state of decay, muttered the doctor. But that's not important now. Are you ever going to get it open? Well, yes, I hope so. The doctor made another quick pass over his Paragosto stick. There was a solid-sounding click from the other side of the door. Yes, smiled the doctor. It took you a while, but you did it. Benny looked between the doctor and the door. This, she sighed, is going to take all the fun out of archaeology. They met in Jan's tent. Kathleen, Ace, Moira, Rosha, and Jan. It looked for a while like nobody was going to say anything. They sat in a circle, both Ace and Rosha at Jan's side. Kathleen just shook his head and sighed. It was Moira who broke the silence. We'll have the funeral tonight, if nobody has any objections. It'll bring us together, like the Great Wheel was supposed to. Besides, we don't want the authorities asking any questions about this. Jan leaned down close to Ace and whispered, I'm sorry, I'm just all... I don't know. Christopher used his powers against that thing. He gave his life for... Rosha and Ace glanced at each other. After a moment's eye contact, Ace put an arm around the man. It's okay, she told him. I don't understand, Jan sighed. Don't understand anything anymore. Moira ran a hand along the tent material. There's a threat here, to all of us. We need to band together to fight it. We don't need any more problems. Can anybody tell me what happened in there? Ace asked. I mean, we all saw the same thing, but what was it? We should have been safe, Kathleen muttered. We are prey in the woods, but safe when we reach the wheel. Everybody knows that. Something must have brought that intruder upon us. Somebody's inner flaw. It followed us to the wheel. Hush, Kathleen. Rosha had been looking despondently at her boots. It doesn't matter now, does it? We've lost Christopher. We just lost him. Everybody dies sometime, you know? I loved him very much. So did we all. Moira had been staring intensely at Rosha. You're not obliged to answer, now that we're not on the wheel. But why do you want to stay on Heaven? Why do you want the rest of us to go? Rosha shook her head. I don't want to talk about it. Christopher would have understood, love. Let me go, will you? She stood and walked quickly from the tent. Ace had seen the tears that were welling in the woman's eyes, and felt horribly guilty. But Jan was staring into the distance again. It might be months before he could come to terms with the grief. Years before he could really dispose of it. The horror was going to carry in front of his eyes for a long time. Ace gave Jan's arm a gentle squeeze, and knew that she had to be with him tonight. Benny pushed the door open carefully. There was a rustle as new air rushed in to move the old dust. It was a round room, with a strange rod-like mechanism mounted on a turntable in the center. The roof was a slatted half-globe. The walls were covered with a strange rough lettering, done in a tiny hand. The whole place was colored dark blue, and the mechanism was bright gold. That's the only thing we know about the Heavenites, Benny muttered. Great color sense. The doctor had walked around the central podium, and had stopped. We know something else now, he said. Benny walked round to look. It was a skeleton, a tall, rather top-heavy creature with an angular skull. It was hanging from 3 manacles, chained to the wall. The remaining manacle hung free behind the thing's ribcage, the arm swinging lightly in the air that had entered the chamber. Ritual sacrifice? Suggested Benny, then corrected herself. No, that's just the sort of assumption I hate. Indeed. The doctor reached out his umbrella and gently tapped the shackles. This is a scientific building. Have a look at the device over there. Benny gently stepped up on the podium and, without touching it, examined the long rod that was balanced amid a mesh of gears and levers. Aha! A telescope! A refractor! Not amazingly powerful. Didn't have to be, since this observatory's underground. She put her eye to the telescope and sighed. I see absolutely no ships. The shackles don't belong here. They've been roughly welded to the wall. You can see the heat marks. He wasn't wounded, the doctor was musing. At least, his bones weren't broken. Benny hopped off the podium and joined him. Or a male who just happened to have a huge pelvic girdle. Mammalian, probably something like a bear with an opposable thumb. Oh, yes, I see. What? The doctor frowned as Benny stood in front of the skeletal creature. She mimicked doing up the shackles on both her legs, then the one on the right arm. She was left-handed, unlike me. She couldn't fasten her own left cuff with only one free hand. Yes! The doctor dropped to his knees and began to scuffle about the floor. No need to grovel, said Benny. I'm fairly secure in my brilliance. You managed to find... The doctor suddenly spotted something and grabbed it, holding it up to the light. A tiny sliver of metal. The key! So why would Ms. Astronomer Bear shackle herself to the wall? Benny asked, looking at the key. "Should we inquire too deeply?" "Oh, yes," the doctor nodded, jumping up. He wandered towards the skeleton and sniffed the bones. "Not much bone marrow. No smell of putrefaction." He squatted again and examined the floor. Traces of fine grey dust stuck to his fingers. "Smell that." "Very olfactory, aren't you?" Benny took a sniff. "Mushroom omelette?" "Close." The doctor looked around the observatory, his face darkening as his eyes looked into the distance of space and time. "After all these years," he whispered. He turned to Benny. "I must get back to Joycetown." Benny pretended to consider. "Well, I think I can spare a moment." "Good. Something terrible is happening here. We may already be too late." The doctor jumped to his feet. "Do you have any transport? Miller had business at his base." "I have a horse." Bernice took the key from the doctor. "But there's something I have to do first." She unlocked the manacles on the skeleton, and it fell. As it did so, a tiny scroll dropped from its hand. Benny picked it up. "Do you want to examine this?" The doctor was already at the door. "On the way," he muttered urgently. Ace and Jan walked slowly around the dying embers of the fire. They were holding hands, but Ace wasn't sure if Jan knew about that or not. He was quite lost, curled up inside, not looking at her. And she'd come to this place to grieve herself. Not a lot of time for that. Well, Jules wouldn't have minded. He'd have said to go for it. He'd driven up to those gates like a madman, the big archlight shining down in the battered old car. That was all such a long time ago. Ace wasn't sure why that particular scene kept coming back to her. The travelers had wrapped Christopher's body in a black sheet and given him a pewter space crown to clutch. Then, every one of them, even the children, had walked up and touched the corpse. Corpse. What a crap word for a dead person. And said goodbye. Ace had said thanks to Christopher for saving her life, but had asked him in a whisper not to torment Jan with it. She told him that he was still exactly what he wanted to be. They had danced for an hour, a very controlled dance. The travelers knew it by heart. Ace had joined in, holding warm and solid hands with Moira and Jan. She tripped and stumbled at the steps, but she wouldn't have missed it. They formed a circle around the fire, and nobody was excluded. William the cook called the patterns in a Palair rhyme, and the circle flexed back and forth. As they danced, Jan had started a wail, a big low cry that spread across the travelers until they were all doing it. Rosha had taken a huge breath and bellowed at the sky, longer and louder than anyone else. Ace watched her, wishing that she could get rid of it all like that. But, as the scream faded, Ace felt the weight settle back onto the woman's shoulders. Whatever had died with the scream, pain still lived inside her. That had made Ace cold with the slow horror of it. After it was over, they took Christopher to the shallow hole a mile from the camp, covered him over, and left him. Moira said he was in the arms of the goddess, and was a man again now, lucky in the love of the earth. They had trudged back to camp, singing an old song in Palair that was full of hope and dreams. Jan and Ace had sat by the fire and watched it burn out, the cinders drifting upwards in a spiral. They were silent until Ace had stood up and made Jan walk with her. She was cold, and Jan must have been freezing. "Take me up into the woods," she said. "Yeah," Jan nodded, dully. "If you want. I was just remembering. Bring a guitar, or whatever you call it." So Jan did. Bernice had urged the horse on, and now they were galloping across the plains, towards the light of Joycetown in the distance. The doctor was sitting straight in the saddle behind Benny, not holding on with his hands, but supporting his umbrella across his lap. He had already stared at the scrap of parchment, shaken his head, and replaced it in his pocket. He seemed deep in thought. "Where do you come from?" he asked Bernice. "Originally?" Benny shouted over the sound of the hooves. "Beta Capricis, Earth Colony. My dad was a bigwig with Space Fleet. Mom stayed at home with me until I was 7.
What happened then?
The Daleks did. When the war broke out, we were suddenly tactically important. Dad was at the front, of course, but they broke through. Mum grabbed me and my doll Rebecca and ran for one of the shelters. She dropped Rebecca and shoved me through the door. It shut after me, but Mum could have opened it again. Only she'd run back down the street for Rebecca, silly thing. The Daleks started bombarding the city with plasma beams. Mum was caught in the first blast." The doctor closed his eyes. "I'm very sorry." No. Long time ago now. Not very important. Loads of people lost family. Dad never came back. He vanished after a scrap with the Daleks. Bunch of idiots said he'd run away, but that's totally impossible, you see. Dad wasn't like that at all. No. So I was sent to military academy as an orphan. I wasn't very good at it, though, because a plasma bolt shot between Benny and the doctor. The horse bucked, sending the doctor flying. Benny pulled hard on the reins and grabbed a handgun from the saddle. Blasts of blue light skittered across the ground. The doctor rolled, clods of earth flying up around him. As the horse bucked beneath her, Benny aimed carefully out into the darkness, watching for the source of the blasts. "There," she whispered, squeezing the trigger. A little copse of trees was illuminated by the blast, and a figure flew backwards. Benny calmed the horse and jumped down. The doctor had stood up, shielding his eyes after the glare. "Because I was such a bad shot," Benny said, "but I've got better since then." Ace and Jan sat, their backs to a tree, looking down the valley in the moonlight. A light mist had risen, and owls were hooting mournfully in the dark forest behind them. Janet began to pluck randomly at the strings of his guitar, and at first, Ace had been dispirited by the noise. Just single, isolated notes, floating out across the valley, and dying. But gradually, the notes began to form sequences, and the sequences turned into a worked-out series of chords. A melody began to drift through the forest. It was a sad tune, simple and gentle, and it caressed around its gentle motifs. Ace could hear patterns rise and fall, sometimes like great empires fighting, sometimes like a single person speaking up, and then vanishing into the melody again. Despite herself, her thoughts drifted back to Julian again. She was surprised to find herself sobbing. Not hard sobs, letting something awful out, like they'd usually been in the past. This was soft. The only thing you could do when you heard the music. Julian would have been crying too. Finally, the music died away, a last gentle note echoing across the valley. Jan looked up, and Ace saw he was sadly smiling. "Jan," she murmured, Oh, God. No, wait." She wiped her face roughly and took a deep breath. "It's fine now," Jan sighed, putting his guitar down. "At least for the moment it's fine. Shall we talk about something good? About space or something?" So Ace leaned back into his arms, pulling them around her like a pullover. She told him about her life, about faraway Perryvale. Jan believed every word, because he believed in magic. "I want to come too," he chuckled. "Take me away in your TARDIS and we'll go duff up some clowns." "Yeah," Ace nodded firmly. "I wouldn't mind. I'll ask the doctor." That didn't sound good, as she said it. But then Jan kissed her for the first time in the real world. The kiss was solid and warm, and it got so passionate and angry that Ace knew she didn't want to be out there in the cold anymore. "All right," she whispered. "I've been thinking about something I want you to do. Why don't we go back to your tent?" Jan looked at her, surprised. "Gods," he muttered. "That sounded gorgeous. You're on." He stood up, pulling her up into his arms. "Bad mistake," Ace grinned, running her hand down his spine. "You don't know what I want you to do yet, do you?" Jan shook his head and looked into Ace's eyes. His pupils were huge with the night. "Whatever you wish," he breathed. "I don't care." They ran down the hill, into the camp, and past Moira's tent. From inside came the sounds of low female conversation. Rosha and Moira were together tonight. Ace was glad at that, and smiled as she opened Jan's tent flap and pulled him inside. They fell on a mess of rugs, kissing. After a while, Ace gently disengaged herself from Jan's mouth. "You're eager," she whispered. "We haven't done what I've been thinking about yet." "Well, no," Jan gasped, his voice rough. "So now it's time. Sit up." Jan did so, but from his expression, it was clear that he was in no mood for games. "Right," Ace slapped the man's knee. "I've been into this idea since I met you. You see all this hair, all this stuff that's bound up to my head? Yes? Take it down. Get rid of the clips and all that, but gently, right? Pull it and I'll go off back to Joycetown." Jan was smiling now. "Turn your back, then." Ace did so, and shivered deliciously as Jan began to undo the clips that kept her hair in place. "We're both alive, right?" she whispered. "Yes. And we've both had enough of death. You're very good at that, you know. How are you with brawls?" "Oh," Jan muttered, stretching a hand forward so that Ace could see it. He made a little undoing motion. "Easy as..." and his fingers burst into flame. Ace jerked back. No!" Jan let go of her hair and moved the burning digits away from her. "Don't be afraid. I'm sorry. Maybe you ought to just go back to town." "What is it?" Ace asked, staring. He wasn't being burnt, she was sure. Jan moved around to face her. "My power. What I got from the military. That's what I meant when I said that there was one thing I could do well. I'm a pyrokinetic. I can make tiny fires. I do it when my blood's up about something. Useful, eh?" "Yeah, of course it is." Jan concentrated on his hand, and the flame vanished. Ace touched the flesh. It wasn't particularly warm. "Well," Jan sighed, "that's the end of that, so..." So Ace kissed him again, and shoved him back onto the rugs, pulling open the knots at his collar, kissing his snake. "So if I get burnt," she whispered, "I get burnt, don't I?" The arm lay in the bracken, still twitching. Smoke curled from its shoulder end. There was no sign of its owner. "Now that's what I call self-control," said Bernice. The doctor looked back towards the lights of the town and frowned. "Exactly the opposite," he whispered.